Wonderful. My name is Carolina. I am the Acting Executive Director of the Cambridge Human Rights Commission. Thank you all so much for being here. I am joined by Patrick McCormick, the Chief Information Officer for the City of Cambridge IT Department. Patrick will start us off by sharing some information about algorithms generally. But before we get started, please keep in mind that the Commission does not and cannot provide any legal advice. So nothing in today's presentation should be considered legal advice. And along those lines, if you have any questions at the end of the presentation, please keep them general. Do not share personal details or any other identifying information when sharing a question. I'll begin by sharing the PowerPoint presentation with some information. Let me just make sure that's the right screen. I believe it is. So to ask any questions, please type your questions into the Q&A box and click send. We'll accept questions at the end of both presentations. Please note that only presenters will be able to view your questions, and we will address questions at the end of the presentation, and typed questions will not be recorded. Please note that you can send an anonymous question if you check the box, if you don't want your name attached to your question in the Q&A. Are there any questions before we begin? All right, wonderful. So as I mentioned, Patrick McCormick will kick us off. Patrick, welcome.
Hey, good afternoon, and thank you, Carolina, Sarah, and the Human Rights Commission for having me. And this is such a fascinating, big topic. I hope we can shed a little bit of light on it in a practical way and have time for a conversation. Carolina, for what it's worth, I can't turn on my video, though the presentation might be better without me on camera.
Give me 1 second, Patrick. I'll make sure.
No problem. And you're going to share my slides as well, or should I?
I'll share your slides. Yeah. I was told that they're not being shared right now, so let me try that again.
Okay, no problem at all. So thanks everybody for making some time this afternoon.
Right. Can everyone see that screen? Let's see.
I can.
All right. And are you just seeing your slide on there, Patrick?
Now I'm seeing to ask questions with the next slide is the first of my deck.
Okay. Does that look right?
No, that's still showing instructions for asking questions. Oh, that's it right there.
Perfect.
Okay,
Sorry
terrific.
about that. Yeah, thanks so much.
No problem at all. So again, thanks for having me. We can go ahead to the next slide. So like I said, it's a really big topic, a really interesting topic. So I think we'll just try to touch on it. And again, hopefully have some practical information in terms of how algorithms, what are they and why are they all around us? And what is algorithmic bias? What are some of the causes of that bias? And what are things we can do to be aware and protect against algorithmic bias? And hopefully between Carolina and I, since I'm not expert in algorithmic bias in fair housing per se, my overview is a bit more general, but between us, I hope we can kind of intersect on that. So we can go ahead to the next slide. And so, it's probably everyone knows algorithms, they've been around for a long time. Humans have been using them. They are essentially operations or steps to solve problems that derive from math and have history going back here. I'm not going to read everything on these slides, but this is just to give a little background back to 2500 BC, and various cultures and mathematics have made use of algorithms. So they're really part of our collective human history long before our experience that we have online through computers and the internet. So next slide. So these are, just some examples of how we encounter algorithms. Often we encounter these without really thinking. And in many ways, they provide really convenient sorting of information for us. In other ways, we may not always realize what we're missing because they are sorting sometimes on behalf of what we're looking for and sometimes on behalf of companies and organizations and what they want to present. So, search engines are a great example. In the early days of search engines, if a few of us search for something, we'd get a very similar result. But these days, our results are very tailored based on our history and, again, what a search engine is looking to serve up. So that is constantly evolving. And of course, the same goes for advertising. In theory, algorithms are helping not only companies sell things to us, but to serve up things that are most of interest to us. But again, that's, it's not always the case, and we don't always know why or what's happening behind the scenes. Education, work, there are all kinds of examples where algorithms are sometimes doing fairly simple operations and sorting, and other times doing pretty sophisticated things that may have unintended outcomes. Again, even entertainment, if we're using a streaming service, why are we seeing certain things first to present to us to engage with? Of course, most notably social media, where increasingly what we interact with is based on a very complex set of drivers by those companies. And we don't, again, the transparency isn't often there for us to know. And, more extreme examples, if I'm a Uber or Lyft driver, the algorithm in some ways is my boss or manager. It's doing all kinds of things behind the scenes in terms of not only assigning work, but also rating performance and even calculating pay. And that is not necessarily equitably distributed or clear how it's working. And, lastly, for essential services like healthcare, housing, finance, algorithms can be used in, again, very useful ways to make those services available, but sometimes in unintended ways that may in fact be biased. On to the next slide, please. So what is algorithmic bias? I mean, it pretty much is, as one would guess. It's a systemic and repeatable set of errors in a system that create these unfair outcomes and can privilege groups or individuals over others, just like this definition says. And I've just put down a few examples that are relatively widely known. And in these cases were made public as they were discovered. In the case of Amazon recruiting candidates for jobs, it was quite clear that their use of algorithms were biased against women. And so they admitted as much and made some changes. In this particular healthcare algorithm, there were biases against race in terms of what sort of healthcare was qualified for and made available. And lastly, this predictive policing tool, which can be as sinister as that sounds, the algorithm was dispatching police or recommending that they go to certain neighborhoods, not actually based on how much crime, or at least not entirely based on that, and weighted by other factors that really were biased and racist. So these are just a few examples to give folks an idea. There are many out there. I think, and you can go on to the next slide, please. And I think the good news, if there is some here, is that with greater awareness comes greater scrutiny and more resources to guard against it. But we are, I think, still in the middle of these things getting sorted out. So in terms of just breaking down some of the causes, and there's some overlap here, but the cause to begin with are systemic and implicit biases that are around us and individuals project, and that as systems are being developed, without sufficient review, those biases can become baked right into the system. So that's one source, is just that human bias. And then the system bias, again, this is very much the next step, is when systems are being designed and developed, it can become a piece of the architecture in some way. And again, if not thoroughly reviewed, can be something that's effectively hardwired into a system. Now, probably the most worrying, and I mean, I don't want to say most common because I'm not looking at a whole lot of research or anything, but the underlying data. So algorithms rely generally on data, and we're hearing a lot about this now in the broader category of artificial intelligence with large language models. And so these sorts of systems really are trained on data or rely on data sets. And if those data sets are incomplete or reflect biases, that's the real problem that's going to surface in the results. So I think there's a lot of focus on that right now. The expectation that particularly in areas that are essential services, that the data set should be known and they should be scrutinized to make sure that they do not reflect and have bias within the data sets. In many cases, data sets just simply are not broad enough to reflect our overall population and diversity. And of course, that results in all kinds of problems. So next, the algorithmic calculations are not known. And that can become a problem even for organizations and individuals that are making use of algorithms. As they get more complex, and one might think the intent is clear, but without understanding the calculations, it's harder to ensure that they are not biased. So that's something else that's increasingly being looked at and asked for, which is to say there needs to be transparency to see how those algorithmic calculations are being performed, as well as what the data sets are. And look, the last two have more to do with the human judgment to guard against these things. First of all, those algorithms need to be extensively tested. And again, there's more pressure to do that now, but insufficient testing is going to result in poor outcomes. And I think we always need to be conscious of the fact that while even if an algorithm is helping inform a process or service, there are certain things that really require human review in intervention because the outcomes are just too important and too sensitive. And so I think constantly thinking about, is this appropriate, even if we can automate it, is always a question that needs to be asked. And again, those are questions that are being asked about algorithms. Those are questions that are being asked now about artificial intelligence because again, the results may not be correct or equitable. So on to the next slide. So what can we do to protect against algorithmic bias? These are in many ways the other side of the coin of the causes. As I just said on that last slide, a lot of it is about the testing and scrutiny. And so that burden should be falling on the developers and the commercial use service providers. But as members of the public, I think it's up to all of us to raise those expectations and ensure that occurs. Again, I think the trend is in the right direction, but this is not a regulated space, so it's really important to be aware of it. Similarly, with transparency and accountability, that idea of being able to see the code, so to speak. Some folks might be familiar with the concept of open source software code. That's essentially what we're talking about here, is algorithms should be open to scrutiny, and it doesn't mean we all have the technical skills to examine an algorithm, but if they are open and transparent, then some folks will be able to do that, and we can rely more collectively on each other. Thirdly, while existing laws and protections don't always seem to keep up, and they don't keep up with the fast changing technology landscape, I think it's important for us and for folks, like the commission, to be able to point us back to existing resources and laws where we can determine whether or not rights are being violated, or there's bias being perpetuated in some area that maybe that service may be covered by certain laws and entities. I also think this depends on the situation, but where an individual can question whether and how algorithms are being used. And in some instances, it may be possible to ask for alternative processes if there are some concerns about whether or not it's an equitable outcome. So I think being able to ask those questions and sometimes look for alternative processes may be a path. And lastly, I think advocacy and education, just as I think this session today is partly aimed at, is just raising awareness of the use of algorithms and how algorithmic bias is out there, and what are the risks. Not only folks here today, but with our friends and family and peers, and that will continue to raise the bar on expectations, and perhaps even as laws and regulations evolve to address these issues better. And again, hopefully shape the solutions and interventions in the near and not so near future. And on to the next. So I just wanted to provide for folks who are interested some other sources, and there are many more than these, but I just chose a few articles and some policies and guidelines that shed a little bit more light on this topic and might be of interest. And that is it for me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Patrick. I'll stop sharing my screen for a moment. Really appreciate your presentation and all the important topics you raised. I did mention that I will do Q&A at the end, which you could submit a question through the chat box or raise your hand. I also wanted to note that both of our presentations will be translated. So translated slides will be available next week. So any folks seeking that, please reach out to us and we could provide that. And we're also happy to share a copy of both of our presentations. All right, so now I will share my screen again and hopefully not mess it up. Give me 1 second. All right. So I'll check in with my colleagues to make sure I am showing the correct screen.
Yep, looks good, Carolina.
Perfect. Thanks, Patrick. All right. So I want to welcome you all again to our presentation. So Patrick, thank you so much for giving us very helpful information, kind of more broadly about algorithms and technology. My portion of the presentation will be more focused on how this applies in the fair housing space and the opportunities and challenges that that will bring. So for today's session, I will start by giving a quick overview of the Human Rights Commission and who we are, and discuss what protected classes we recognize here in the city. I will then cover the benefits of technology in fair housing and then discuss some challenges. Next, I will discuss some cases and dive deeper into a more recent case of algorithmic discrimination. And I will end by discussing some housing provider best practices, and I'll share a bit about other enforcement agencies, and we'll end with some Q&A. So first, what do we do? What is the Cambridge Human Rights Commission? We are a city law enforcement agency. We're located at 51 Inman Street on the second floor in Cambridge. That's not to be confused with City Hall. And what we are is we're an agency that receives and investigates complaint of discrimination that occur in Cambridge. So that of course means in housing, but we also accept complaints of discrimination in employment, education, and public accommodations. Our role is to enforce two City of Cambridge ordinances. The first being the Cambridge Human Rights Ordinance, that's where employment, education, and public accommodations complaints fall, and the Cambridge Fair Housing Ordinance. These ordinances prohibit discrimination based on protected classes, which I will discuss in more detail in the next slide. So what does a protected class mean? Generally, there are laws that provide additional protections to certain groups of people. You will notice that there are some similarities between what the state of Massachusetts recognizes and what the city of Cambridge recognizes. The ones bolded on the slide are not protected under the Federal Fair Housing Act. It's important to note that both majority and minority traits are protected. For example, men can be protected from sex discrimination as well as women. You could be discriminated if you're a member of a group, perceived to be a member of a group, or associated with a member of one of these groups. All of these protected classes apply to ads, public housing, private realtors, and landlords. Just to take a deeper dive into what these protected classes mean, I'll provide a few examples. So the first being active military personnel or veterans are protected. So that would be if you're denied a housing opportunity or charged higher security deposits if you're a veteran. Age under the City of Cambridge means 18 plus. Disability can be physical or mental. Gender identity, that's folks who are transgender or in any way gender nonconforming, are protected. Sexual orientation, that could be if you're gay, straight, bisexual, pansexual, etc. Marital status and familial status, so that means, living with someone, married or not. Oftentimes we see family status come up in complaints regarding lead paint. Ancestry and national origin are similar. National origin is where you are from, and ancestry is your family background. So both are protected. Public assistance or source of income means that you can't discriminate based on the receipt of any form of public assistance. So that could be receiving a Section 8 voucher, SSI, Social Security income, SSDI, or any other rental assistance programs. Race and color are also similar. Color is very literal. That's, how much melanin we may have in our skin and oftentimes how other people identify us. And race is how we identify. Religion means religious beliefs, even ones that are not common are protected. So you can't discriminate against a religion that you haven't heard of, that you have heard of, or someone who's an atheist. And sex means you can't discriminate based on sex. And keep in mind that, of course, applies to sexual harassment in a housing environment. So now that you have a general understanding of the Human Rights Commission and the protected classes, Let's move on to jurisdiction. So what jurisdiction means is that is the authority granted by our ordinances to the commission to investigate and rule on legal matters. And that's according to the subject matter of the case and the geographical region in which the issue took place. At the Human Rights Commission, we can accept cases if the discrimination occurred in Cambridge. So that means that a complainant or the person who's filing a complaint with us can live outside of the city of Cambridge, but the respondent housing provider or individual to have discriminated must reside in Cambridge. Additionally, the alleged discrimination must have occurred within the past 180 days. So that's roughly 6 months. There is an exception if the conduct first occurred prior to 180 days and it is ongoing. And then the last element that must be reached for us to accept a complaint is that the alleged discrimination must have been based on the complainant's membership in a protected class, which we just discussed. So these next two slides will very briefly describe our complaint process overview. So the way our process begins is that we begin by interviewing complainants. We have an online intake form that folks can use to make sure that a complaint meets our jurisdictional requirements, so what we just discussed. Then I would draft a complaint unless a complainant is represented, and we would serve that complaint on the respondent. So that could be the landlord, property manager, and any other party who's alleged to have discriminated in some ways. After the landlord or housing provider receives your complaint, they have 10 days to respond. I'll get a copy of that response and you will as well. After that, I would typically interview witnesses, review relevant documents. That could be leases, emails, written communications, and also relevant case law. At any point in this process, we also act as mediators, or we assist folks in reaching a resolution to their complaint. That could happen soon after filing or, 2 months after you had filed a complaint. If mediation is not successful, I would continue on through the investigative process to the determination stage. So that's where I would describe either finding probable cause or lack of probable cause that discrimination occurred based on our legal standards. If probable cause is found, then there's two options for fair housing cases, which are different than employment and public accommodations and education cases. There could either be an additional opportunity to settle the complaint, and if that's not successful, we would have a public hearing at the commission, or either party can elect to send their case to the Massachusetts Attorney General's office, where they will separately investigate that complaint and potentially file in Superior Court. If lack of probable cause is found, then the case is dismissed as it pertains to our commission, but you still retain some rights. We don't have an appeals process, so if there is lack of probable cause, that's just kind of the end of our involvement with the case. So now let's get into the foundational piece of information today. Technology has transformed the housing industry, offering both opportunities and challenges for fair housing practices. In this section, we will explore how technology can enhance fair housing while noting some potential consequences and case overviews. So why do we care? Why are we having this conversation? Why are we discussing this? Discussing the use of technology and algorithmic discrimination in fair housing is essential to address ongoing inequalities, adapt to changing digital landscape, and to ensure that technology and algorithms are used in a way that promote fairness, justice, and equal access to housing. Additionally, housing processes have increasingly moved online, from property listings to rental applications. And as Patrick discussed, algorithms are used all the time to filter and evaluate applications, or applicants rather, and that can result in discriminatory outcomes if not carefully designed and also routinely monitored. Lastly, algorithmic discrimination can potentially shift responsibility away from individuals or institutions to algorithms or technology companies. So discussing these issues can help us clarify where responsibility may lie and how to hold those responsible accountable. So we know there are many, many benefits to the use of technology in the housing context. These are not exhaustive lists, but just some examples to keep in mind. So one of the benefits would be, of course, access to information. We have access to a lot of online platforms, a lot of websites, mobile apps, and these provide residents with easier access to property listings, rental applications, information about housing options, what's available, when it's available, reviews on a property, etc. Also, remote property viewing. So if you ever spent time on Redfin or Zillow, a lot of homes have virtual tours, 3D property viewings, and that can allow potential tenants to explore properties remotely, which can be especially useful for residents with disabilities such as mobility challenges, or those seeking housing from a distance, folks who are interested to move to Cambridge but can't be on site. And property management systems. Software helps housing providers efficiently manage their properties, track rent payments, address maintenance requests, hopefully quickly, formalize reasonable accommodation modification policies. And this, of course, the goal is to improve overall tenant satisfaction. Some of the other benefits to using technology in housing, of course, is fair housing training. Technology can be used to train property managers and other staff on relevant fair housing laws, such as the Cambridge Fair Housing Ordinance. And this can be especially useful regarding understanding how Section 8 works and making sure that housing providers are compliant with our laws, because we're charged with not only enforcing our Fair Housing Ordinance, but also the Federal Fair Housing Act, because we've been deemed substantially equivalent to the Federal Fair Housing Act. Also, real-time market information. Technology provides real-time market information, allowing housing providers to adjust their rental prices and offerings based on demand and supply fluctuations. And that can be helpful because there are periods where maybe not as many people are seeking housing. So, rents can reflect that, and it's all real time. So, that can be helpful. And then enhanced communication. So communication between housing providers and tenants has improved through technologies like email, messaging apps, online portals. If you live in a big property in Cambridge, you probably have access to one of these. And this facilitates better communication, which can be essential for resolving issues, creating a paper trail, and ensuring transparency. A paper trail can be helpful when we are investigating housing discrimination complaints, since we need a timeline of all relevant events. And sometimes, when you request that kind of information, that can be helpful to fill holes and, help us review certain policies and processes that housing providers have. Also, it's helpful to easily share, as I mentioned, reasonable accommodation policies or other policies, or to send out notices. If there's been allegations of tenants harassing other tenants, notices can be sent out to a vast variety of people using technology. So while there are many benefits to technology, we must also consider the challenges and the problems that arise. So today, with the aid of new algorithmic tools, housing providers can send prospective tenants applicants to automated systems that compare their data against millions of records. The issue is sometimes this is incomplete, unreliable, or easily confused, and tenants often have, or prospective tenants, little to no opportunity for recourse. We also know that algorithms and data-driven decisions can inadvertently introduce bias. So one of the biggest challenges is, of course, algorithmic bias, which is used in tenant screening, credit checks, advertising, and this could have, definitely being in all of those avenues if not carefully designed and monitored. This would mean that residents can lose out on housing opportunities and not be given a fair chance. I will add that the use of technology was intended to serve as a recommendation for housing providers, but often we're seeing that housing providers just trust computers to make decisions for them, which is problematic. Algorithmic bias often causes a disparate impact on certain protected classes. The next challenge is the digital divide. Not everyone has equal access to or a clear understanding of technology. There could be language barriers as well that makes using these systems difficult. Those without internet access or digital literacy skills may face barriers in accessing housing opportunities. There could be data privacy concerns. If you use tenant data, and you're not in compliance with data privacy laws. and discriminatory advertising. So that's when you have targeted advertising. If it's not carefully implemented, can exclude certain groups or perpetuate discriminatory practices. Similar to the benefits analysis, this challenges analysis is not, or list rather, is not exhaustive. Some of the other issues with using technology in housing is that when housing providers use information about, past arrest or evictions or defaulted loans, this can be a proxy for race and disability. Our community members are at a higher likelihood for disruptions to income and housing stability, which could directly impact eligibility for future rental applications. I also just wanted to add that these types of technologies are not only limited to tenant screening. Housing providers and property management companies also deploy surveillance technologies to control what tenants do once on the property, potentially automate eviction proceedings, and cause other harms to tenants, or maybe even limit tenant organizing. These issues can further deepen economic and housing injustices that already disproportionately impact folks with disabilities, low-income residents, and Black people and people of color. So regarding discriminatory advertising, I wanted to discuss this case, which was brought in 2019 when HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, sued Meta, formerly known as Facebook, for engaging in housing discrimination by allowing advertisers to restrict who is able to see ads on the platform based on certain characteristics such as race, religion, and national origin. And what this did was that it effectively allowed for discriminatory advertising practices. This lawsuit coincides with a broader push by various civil rights groups to scrutinize whether big technology companies are reinforcing real-world biases online by using these algorithms to identify and target specific groups of users. This case was important because it was the first time the federal government challenged algorithmic bias under the Federal Fair Housing Act. Meta was sued by the Department of Justice based on the 2019 HUD investigation. In the DOJ's complaint, they alleged that Meta's advertisement services violated the Fair Housing Act by allowing housing advertisers to use Meta-created categories based on the protected classes I mentioned. Second, they alleged that Meta used a look-alike audience tool, which basically used protected classes to identify additional users with similar characteristics as an advertiser's ideal audience. Lastly, Meta's ad delivery algorithms use protected classes to determine which consumers can see the advertisement. This case was settled in June of 2022, and as part of the settlement, Meta agreed to eliminate features that allow landlords and credit agencies to discriminate against groups of people under those protected classes. Additionally, Meta agreed to make significant changes to its housing ad delivery methods, including no longer using that lookalike audience feature, and to develop a new system for housing ads to address disparities between advertisers' targeted audiences and the group of Meta users who will actually be delivered the ads. In addition, Meta had to pay the maximum civil penalty of $115,000, and a third-party reviewer will be appointed to monitor Meta's compliance with the terms of this agreement. I also wanted to touch on Zillow, which you may be familiar if similar to me, you just look at house prices during lunch breaks. That's a popular real estate website. And it was recently criticized, or has been for some time, for its Zestimates feature, which provides estimated property values using an algorithm. There are some critics who argue that Zestimates were inaccurate and sometimes undervalued homes in predominantly Black neighborhoods, potentially affecting property values and sales in those areas. Zillow has responded by saying the allegations are groundless and that it collects data from public sources, such as homes characteristics, tax assessments, and recent sales, and uses computers to make its estimate. However, Zillow has not disclosed what algorithm it uses, but the company restated that it does not use demographic data in the calculations. On the site, Zillow says that it is an estimate, not an appraisal, but a free research tool. But this could be something to keep an eye on. So next, I would like to dive a bit deeper into this case. It's the Connecticut Fair Housing Center versus CoreLogic Rental Property Solutions case. So this is a case, a legal case that was aimed at ensuring that tenant screening companies, including CoreLogic, adhere to fair housing requirements when making rental decisions on behalf of landlords. This case is rooted in the observation by HUD that excluding rental applications based on those applicants' criminal records disproportionately harms Latinx and Black individuals. The disparity is linked to differences in law enforcement practices, not criminal activity, leading to a call for an individualized review in the rental application process. HUD advises that an individualized review should consider factors like the nature of an offense, the time elapsed, changed circumstances, and advises against considering arrests without convictions. So this case was filed in 2018 in the U.S. District Court, District of Connecticut. And what this case involves is CoreLogic's automated tenant screening tool called CrimSafe, which denied Ms. Arroyo's request to have her son with a disability move in with her after it generated a report stating that it had found a criminal court action related to her son, Mikhail, without any further information. Later, Ms. Arroyo and Mikhail learned that the company had referred to records of his arrest and citation for a minor shoplifting accusation as a disqualifying criminal record, even though he was never convicted and the charge was ultimately withdrawn back in 2014. Ms. Arroyo claims that CoreLogic's criminal background report lacked details and CoreLogic refused to provide information, which violated federal law potentially and her rights as her son's conservator. This also violated the obligation to provide a reasonable accommodation for her disabled son. The impact of this issue was that due to the lack of information and failure to conduct this individualized assessment, Ms. Arroyo's son, Mikhail, remained in a nursing home longer than necessary. A decision came out last year and it was found not in favor of the plaintiff on the Fair Housing Act claims. The court found in favor of CoreLogic on the Fair Housing Act claims because they argued that the plaintiffs failed to provide by a preponderance of evidence that CoreLogic's use of CrimSafe denied or otherwise made housing unavailable. The court held that it was the housing provider's decision. Nonetheless, this case has significant implications for landlords, renters, and the screening industry, as automated decisions by third-party screening companies are becoming more and more common. It also underscores the importance of adhering to fair housing requirements and pushes the importance of conducting these individualized reviews in tenant screening. Future cases may prove probable cause of discrimination in violation of the Fair Housing Act. So if you're a housing provider and you want to be mindful of your use of technology and what the best practices may be, we want to discuss a few options. So the first, of course, is responsible use of technology. So we really recommend that housing providers prioritize responsible technology use to avoid perpetuating bias. So that means, regularly reviewing what technology you're using, updating any tech tools, carefully review which companies you partner with, ask questions if you're not sure how something works. Also, auditing for bias. So implement auditing and evaluation processes to both identify and rectify bias in algorithms or data-driven decisions. Of course, work with experts, work with people who have done this a long time and who are aware of how to improve programming. And then advocacy and community engagement. Housing advocates play a vital role in addressing technology-related fair housing issues. So speak to housing advocates or really get informed about this area of law, which a lot of it is new, and engage with community organizations, tenants associations, policymakers, and just be mindful that this is going to take a lot of effort to be on top of and ask questions and improve for the benefit of us all. I just wanted to share about our different enforcement agencies, which are important. So if you would like to file a housing discrimination complaint, HUD, our federal counterpart, enforces federal law, so the Federal Fair Housing Act. They have a 1-year statute of limitations, which means you have 1 year from the date of a discriminatory act to file with them. Our state counterpart is the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination. They're in downtown Boston. They enforce our state law, Chapter 151B. Their statute of limitations is 300 days. And then, as I discussed, we're the Cambridge Human Rights Commission. We both enforce our Cambridge local law, so our Cambridge Fair Housing Ordinance and Human Rights Ordinance, and the Federal Fair Housing Act, because HUD has deemed our ordinance as substantially equivalent to the Federal Fair Housing Act. So they give us authority to investigate complaints on their behalf. And thank you so much. That's the end of my presentation. I wanted to be sure that you all know how to contact us if you want to discuss this presentation or file a complaint. If you're not sure that you've been discriminated against, that's why our intake process exists, because if we can't help, we have a plethora of referrals and other agencies that you can reach out to anytime. As a reminder, we're located at 51 Inman Street. We're on the second floor. Our main phone number is 617-349-4398. We have a email mailbox. If you fill out the online intake form, it goes to that mailbox, or you could just email that mailbox directly. That's hrc@cambridgema.gov. And of course, check out our website. Any sort of these webinars or other events we have coming on, we put on there, as well as some of our collaborations. So please stay connected. And now I'll stop sharing and open the floor for some questions. All right, so I see a few that have come in through the chat. 1 second here. Patrick, I'm curious if you want to take this. We have an attendee asking, what are some things that housing providers should look for when choosing technology to help with housing decisions?
Yeah, I think, we talked a little bit, both our presentations, about transparency. And I think for a provider, it's important not to just buy a piece of software off the shelf without asking some questions about how it works, who else is using it. In many cases, I think housing may overlap between public, private, and nonprofit sectors. In government, we have a pretty rigorous process where we talk about whether software is qualified for certain things, including protecting privacy and other issues. So, for example, we often look at state contracts and laws around that. So I think it's that awareness. Sometimes there's more awareness for bigger software companies, but as we've seen, sometimes they're the ones who are violating these principles. So, like anything, I would just say it's a matter of doing homework. And if software seems pretty magical in the results it can deliver, those are good reasons to ask, hey, how is that happening? And if it's a salesperson or whoever is providing the tools, to say, do you know how this works? Because again, finding that accountability, whether it's with the manufacturer, the reseller, the vendor, it can be hard, but you really have to keep asking questions. And I think in some cases, if you can't get good answers, it's a reason to either not use a tool or to be really cautious about it. And the other thing I'll add that we do often is ask who else is using a piece of technology or other housing providers, and call your peers and ask about it. We do that all the time, speaking to other cities and towns, particularly if there's a new product that we're concerned might not live up to the hype.
Great, thank you so much. We have another question. How do you know if you're being discriminated against in the housing search process when things are moving so fast? What are some things to look out for? I'm happy to take this question. And that's a good one. And you're right, the housing search process moves very fast. ultimately, if you feel like, a real estate agent isn't getting back to you or not wanting to rent to your family with children, or because you're a person with a disability, or if you were denied and not provided a reason, you can reach out to us because, we have a very low bar in terms of accepting a complaint. So that's, we, in the investigative process, that's what we look at. We look to see if you were denied a housing opportunity based on a protected class. And a part of our investigative process is to ask for data. If you, lost out on an apartment, and you think it's based on your family status, we would ask the housing provider and the broker real estate agent to send us the data and the lease of like who it was rented out to, and ask for email communications and kind of any relevant information. But I would say look out for really, being treated differently is ultimately what we're getting at. So, if everything's going great and suddenly like you don't get calls back anymore, or obviously discriminatory comments or discriminatory emails, we just don't get evidence that straightforward, but that's always helpful to submit to us. Look out for, discriminatory advertisements. If you see a Craigslist ad that says no Section 8 allowed, let us know about that. Sometimes discrimination can be obvious, other time it's more hidden. And that's what we would look at to try to see if there's been a violation of our ordinances. I apologize, I think I'm slightly losing my voice. All right, next question. How does the city of Cambridge use algorithms? How does the city combat biases associated? Do you want to take that one, Patrick?
Sure, happy to do so. The city is really quite cautious about algorithms and these tools. Again, if they're not understood, we don't use them. And of course, the definition of algorithm matters, right? So in the simplest form, an algorithm, which can be quite transparent in the case of housing or some services, might be about means testing. And what you really want to do there in any sort of online or digital system is represent exactly what the provider and end users know on a paper form. What is my income? What is other qualifying aspects? Without doing some sort of weighting, it's often the weighting of results, or prioritizing or sorting that creates the biases and lack of fairness. So as a city, we really avoid some of those tools. Fortunately, I don't think that we have a lot of use. Sometimes those tools are designed for massive amounts of data. The other thing is we have a pretty rigorous process when we're looking for tools. Just as I was saying about what a provider might do, we have a process known as eGov, which is to review what sort of business problems or solutions a department is looking for, and what sort of tools are out there. And just to give folks one example, we found over the I've just been with the city a bit over 3 years, but a couple of years ago, we found that a department that will remain nameless and had very good intentions was using a tool that, and we weren't told about it because it didn't cost any money. And sometimes a tool that doesn't cost money, well, the reason why is they are seeing profit potential elsewhere, and that's by gathering information from users. And we had to explain that we still need to go through the process. We actually changed our guidance, with city leadership, and said, even if you're looking at something that doesn't cost money, we need to review it together because it may violate privacy policies and rely on other sorts of information that the city will not tolerate. So we have a number of guidelines. There's something called the WISP, which is the Written Information Security Policy. These are all designed to ensure that we do not utilize tools that could have these sorts of outcomes, or divulge any kind of information. And again, we need to abide by these rules legally as a public sector organization. So while there may be some areas when it comes to algorithms that need clarification, where we're super cautious about it. And I know sometimes that can be frustrating to our colleagues in different departments that see something that looks and can be useful, but we're just not willing to cut corners when it comes to those sorts of risks. I hope that's helpful.
Great, thank you so much. Next, we have what looks like a comment from wonderful Rachel, who's the ED of the Disability Commission. She states, Pennsylvania's Children and Families Department's algorithms are making it even more likely for kids to be taken away from parents with disabilities. If you have a disability or if you're on Social Security, it grades you as being less fit to parent. Very true. Thank you, Rachel. And I saw one other question just come in. When city agencies require exception to their usual rules, only when the applicant or appellant can establish the need for a reasonable accommodation of a disability, aren't these agencies inadvertently discriminating against other protected classes, such as seniors who may have difficulty with technology, but should not have to prove a need for an alternative to the technology the agency prefers for its efficiencies? Okay, let me just make sure I understand the question. So I think if I'm understanding the question, it is why only reasonable accommodations apply to folks with a disability. That isn't correct. Whoever submitted this, feel free to type in any more information. So, you know, the way a reasonable accommodation is defined as a change to practices or policies to allow for, I see you're asking about city agencies though. I'll answer this question as it pertains to housing, because what it means definitionally is a change to policies and practice to allow for someone with a disability to have equal access to their housing, equally enjoy their dwelling as a person without a disability. I think your question regarding city agencies, so anyone who needs any sort of other accommodation can certainly to ask for them regarding folks who are older or may have difficulty with technology, because that of course can be provided by the city. Apologize if I'm not correctly answering your question, but if there is a need for an accommodation in this way, if you mean as someone who's a city employee, the city would provide it or do its best to make sure that any employee who needs any sort of you know, accommodations in the workplace or assistance in doing their job is something that that the city would provide and look at. I think those were the only questions that came in through the chat, but if anyone wants to raise their hand or ask any other questions, feel free to do so.
And Carolina, you know, I'll just add a little bit. It's not a direct answer to that last question, but I think it's worth mentioning that the city is very conscious of digital equity issues. And that goes for all sorts of individuals and groups. So that, you know, that means a couple things. One, where possible, we work with a lot of local nonprofits and different city agencies to, where possible, provide whether it's devices, connectivity, training, but also to ensure that digital channels are not the only way to inquire about services, to request services, and that sort of thing. So I would say there's, you know, and as much as we're also talking about members of the community seeking services, I think we're always looking to ensure that there's still possible to call someone, to fill out a paper form and all of that. So, you know, for what it's worth, that's a very real issue for those of us, including those of us who work in technology. I'll just say that it's also a big issue in the private sector where you see more and more, if you can't use tools, good luck getting someone on the phone. We're just pushing people away from those channels, and it does create a real barrier for individuals without the tools. So while in some cases we'd like to get the tools to the people if it helps, we're also committed to being able to reach people and people reach us through other channels.
Thanks, Patrick. And this may be a follow-up from that original question. You have someone saying CHA, Cambridge Housing Authority, for example, requires a reasonable accommodation of a disability in order to get a written application instead of applying online for housing. Just one clarifying point, just because this might be confusing for folks, is that Cambridge Housing Authority is not a city agency, so we can accept complaints against other city agencies, but our state counterpart, the MCAD, can. But we can accept complaints against the Cambridge Housing Authority. And then also I did not, so if I'm understanding, that CHA is only able to provide a written application if you have a disability. It's interesting. I'm not sure if I knew that, but if whoever submitted that would like to chat with me, yeah, I'd be interested to learn more about that issue. Stay on for another few minutes if anyone would like to ask any other questions. Otherwise, I welcome anyone attending to, and I'm sure Patrick would agree, to reach out to us if you would like to continue with this conversation or ask more questions. We're available. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions. So we'll end it here. Just a reminder real quick that this presentation will be recorded with closed captioning and put online on YouTube shortly. We also will, for folks who ask for translated slides, we'll be able to provide those as well. And I also just want to send out a heartfelt thank you to Pat McCormick. Thank you so much for joining us, and Sarah Benny, who helped a lot with our Director of Operations with the behind the screens work of this webinar. And please stay connected. We have events like this sometimes online or in person every few months. So please reach out. And of course, if you're interested in filing a discrimination complaint, please feel free to contact us. All that information was in my last slide. So thank you so much.
Thank you.